Hello, everyone. This is Xiao. This is a new episode of Salesforce Web Podcast after so long time. So today I have a returning guest. His name is Andre Fawcett. Hello, Andre.
Hello, thank you for having me
Hello.
back.
After 7 years, I think last time here on the podcast was 2019.
Wow, time flies.
Time flies. So, what you have been doing? If you can shortly brief us up for this 7, 8 years.
7 years. Well, I think probably around that time I was at Salesforce, I think, as product leader. So in that time, I've been working on Salesforce platform, but latterly and largely mostly on Heroku as their chief product officer ultimately, and enjoying the ways in which we can bring the Heroku technology into the Salesforce ecosystem, as well as also expanding Heroku within the broader PaaS market. So that was an enjoyable time at Salesforce. Obviously, we're probably all aware now what's the kind of conclusion has led to with Heroku. It's pretty sad, I must say, from a personal point of view. But nonetheless, the team there and the product that we created and drove, I'll never forget. And the experiences that we got and learnings from that have led us to where we got to today. So much appreciation for Heroku and very honored to be part of the Heroku history. But Salesforce has been a big chapter of my career, but another chapter has opened up that's allowed me to explore a more work-life balance, and that's being a consultant, and has led me back to being more hands-on with customers and clients, where I'm either doing advisory work on product or strategy or technical strategy, building proof of concepts, doing research, or even creating content for some clients. So it's a really good spectrum and a mix for me, and brings me back to some of my original days, really hacking around the platform and the community. And the Heroku time really allows me to explore a much broader spectrum as well around just not just the Heroku platform, but how you integrate with it and bring other platforms integration into it. And of course, unescapedly, AI has come into the mix with the latter few years, and not only Heroku's AI offering, but obviously Agentforce as well. So, spending a lot of time working in AI in and around that, also with ISVs as well. So, really enjoying the consulting world right now, and it's really fit for where I want to be in my life at this stage. So, and happy to be taking the time that I can. I think there's a reason probably why I've not been back for 7 years, and now I'm back now in this current new chapter of my life. So happy to be here. And I think when you and I chatted about this podcast, there was a lot of different ideas, but some of those we might get back to. But recently, of course, we've been talking about Apex user mode and that blog, and I jumped at really writing that blog because it's something that's been something missing from the platform from the very inception. So I think that's really where we were going to dig into in this session. I'm delighted to share a bit more of my thoughts beyond the blog and what
Yeah.
folks should be thinking about.
Yeah. But if we one back, like go one step back, how did it really fall into your radar with this? It's just the summer release, right? Like the winter,
Yeah, I mean,
spring
it
release. How,
really.
yeah.
Obviously, I do. I've reanointed myself with kind of just the luxury of just sitting down and poring over the release notes all the time. I love that, and I get excited about that. So obviously, I saw that feature, but I've been tracking for a while, both when I was in Salesforce. For a time, I was responsible for the Apex runtime as well. How the Apex team have been developing easier ways than the original CRUD and FLS checking methods. I was aghast at
Mm.
really the way that had to be done, especially as an ISV. You literally had to litter your code with, describe checks to see if you could write or update a record or read or update a record or have access to a field. That was very noisy in your code base. And so,
Mm.
we explored frameworks to help us do some of that, but it just was very painful. So eventually, Apex added clauses to the SOCL queries and also different parameters to the database DML operations to run as user mode. And that's been
Mm.
with us, what I think maybe 3 or 4 years now, but it really wasn't a requirement. And this time it really is a requirement to understand. And it's a huge shift for the Apex runtime because Many people have just assumed it can access everything, and that's just the way it is. But when you look at the reality of coding in general in the industry, the principle of least privilege is a really important one to learn, because especially in the days that we live in, the most significant amount of crime is typically cybercrime in hacking and getting access to data. And sometimes the nature of some of those hacks are so deep that it doesn't matter what you put in your code, they've got access. But sometimes it is important to make sure that if they've got access to run certain elements of the code, that code can't do more than it was intended to do.
Mm,
And so principle of least privilege means that that code can only access the data in the fields that it needs to do what it has the purpose, what it needs to do, and no more, no less. So that if anybody's running as that the user that runs that code, then they can't do anything else necessarily to
mm,
access data. And that's really one of the key principles, and that's been around since that Unix days. It's for a very long time. And sometimes when I remember moving from Windows to Mac, I was banging my head against all these CLI commands that just weren't working. I had to understand what sudo was and things like that. And eventually, I realized that's a good thing, because
mm,
even running on my own computer, it's safeguarding what I can do and saying, no, as a minimum, you're going to have this. You have to elevate your permissions using sudo to do that. And that
mm,
creates a really safe mental model, because it makes you think about security, and it's painful if you haven't been. And it was when I moved from Windows to Mac. But now I'm
mm,
like, yeah, I get it. Thank you for doing that. When my scripts fail because I haven't got the admin privileges on my machine, I'm like, great, thank you. Because if there's ever a script that I don't know is running, gets that, I want that to fail as well.
right,
So,
right.
what caught my eye with this is it's probably the biggest shift. We talk about lots of things in Apex that's happened over the years, big new features that have been added to it. But I actually would say that this is probably the biggest since its inception, because it completely flips around that security model.
Mm,
Once you run Apex at API 67, if you run a query or different attempts in DML, it's going to fail if the user doesn't have the right permissions.
yeah. So I will attach your blog post to our show notes. So for the people who want to read everything in details. But here you already mentioned the least privilege principle, right? That's what actually drive this change in Salesforce for the security control in Apex. So, in my naive understanding, is that in the past, the Apex code by default runs in the system mode, which basically means it has access to all the objects, all the fields, and even I think there is this with sharing, without sharing. That's the record level
Yeah, we
control,
should
right?
talk about that in a moment, I think, because that is still different.
That's a subtle differences.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to tell here is that in the past, the door was like a bit wide open, right? The code runs for the developers is that we tend to follow the happy path. The code runs, there's no error, nothing's blocked, then we're happy, we ship the code. But then maybe we don't really need the door to be that wide open, right? We should keep it a bit narrow. We don't need the Apex code to access all these objects, all these fields, even though it still worked in the past. And it was the developer's role to set whether it's like this system mode or the user mode, as you said. But in the past, we didn't even have this user mode term. It's called with
Yeah, the nearest you
security
had with user mode was
enforced.
really just checking the permissions deliberately in your code, which was largely quite a chore to do that. So,
Right. You have to
you
check
never really
each
had.
every single field.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
it presented a huge amount of overhead and noise in the code to do that. So we really didn't have user mode until it was officially introduced a few years
Hmm.
back now. But it had
But
to be still an opt-in thing. You had to change your code to do it.
because I remember a lot of the customers I worked in, when I checked the Apex code, a lot of SQL queries, they don't have any this with security enforced,
Hmm.
those terms. I don't know, it's the annotations. I think it's because at the very beginning, Salesforce, the SQL queries doesn't have those keywords, and then at a certain point, then it's
Yeah,
introduced.
for Stockholm, I mean, this also represents a point where there's been a kind of evolving story of how it's
Right.
worked within Apex for Stockholm, because with security enforced is disappearing as part of this change, and it's only with user mode or with user or with system mode that you have. So it's very clear now, the two, and those mirror what you do with DML as well. So that's a bit of a legacy keyword to use, but you still have the user mode and system mode in SOCL, and user mode and system mode parameters for your DMLs.
Okay.
But yes, you have to apply them, and if you're not applying them, I think that's the path C that I talk about in the blog. You're just not yet ready to switch this on, because what will happen is as soon as you move to API 67, you'll start getting exceptions from your Apex code, because likely the profile of the user, the permission set rather, or the profile that the code has historically been running under, doesn't have necessarily all the permissions. So you might have written some Apex code to go and generate quotes from an opportunity, as the example I always pull to, is a more businessy, understandable operation. You might have given users access to those objects and some custom objects around that service. But you might not have given them everything, and you might not have never noticed, because the Apex runs as system mode, and it just
Right.
merrily accesses everything.
Yep.
So then this is that point I was talking about earlier. You might say, oh, well, I'll just patch up the permission set or the profile to add the missing fields and objects. And that's where I say, no, don't resist that. You need to step back and say, what fields and objects does the user need versus what the code needs? Because if it's fields and objects the code needs, then that's when you should be explicitly using system mode. With API 67, you don't need to explicitly say user mode, because it's there by default. But you will need to explicitly say system mode, and that's the
So,
proper thing to do. If really those
just
fields are
just
not.
let me repeat if I understand correctly. So before version 67, if you implicitly don't give any keywords in the SQL or DML, then that's by default the system mode. But after version 67, it flipped the coin. By default, is the user
Yep.
mode, which is more tied to the user's permissions. And
Yeah, so you'll
then
get
a
those
lot of
exceptions.
code could fail, right? If I never really add those keywords in my code and I have a millions of Apex classes, then most of
Yeah,
them I would expect them
and
to
particularly
fail.
your tests might fail as well, your Apex tests,
Right.
because even if you've been using run as in your Apex tests, the user that you're running as might also not have the right permissions. So your Apex tests might fail, your user interactions might fail.
And those
Um,
test failure actually are good because they catch
yeah,
the real scenarios, right?
yeah, exactly. And your end user failures, while not ideal, are good as well, because they're bringing to light, is this permission missing? So really, if you have been using user mode and system mode since they've come out over the last few years, then you're in a kind of good position, which I call path A in the blog, because you've really started to understand what code paths need user mode and which code paths need system mode, and you've annotated accordingly with those features. And switching on this default user mode means that where you've annotated run as user mode is a bit superfluous now, because it already is running as user mode, so you don't need that. And you can go ahead and take those out, but you could leave them in. They're harmless. So if you're in path A, where you've deliberately been cognitively using system mode and user mode in your SOCL and DML, then that's great. What you might find is, like, perhaps some of your tests or your permission sets maybe aren't fully um, sort of designed in the right way, and I talk a bit about that in the blog. You know, um, but largely you'll have probably figured out the correct permission sets and profiles, because you understand the difference between system and user mode. But if you're in kind of what I call path B, where you've kind of got some awareness of testing permissions, you'll have started putting the right profiles and permission sets together. But if it's not throughout your code base, you're still going to get some failures. but mentally your development team and yourself have been aware that you have to have permission sets. Largely, I recommend permission sets over profiles. You have to have them in place to be a digital representation of what your security model is. That's
Mm.
really probably the most important thing here, is having awareness of what a permission set is and how to design them properly for your business scenario.
Right.
And so Path B is a good place if you already started using user mode, because you kind of got your head around it. And Path
Mm-hmm.
C is really, you haven't really, as you explained, you've just been used to running in system mode. You've got none of these user mode clauses or system mode clauses in your code whatsoever. And that's where you're really going to have to sit down and make sure everybody understands the difference between user mode and system mode and design those permission sets.
Mm. But you also, in your blog, I remember you mentioned the permission set is a prerequisite for this task. Is it really
Yeah.
so?
Yeah, permission set groups are also handy. And one of the things that I think I'm going to do as a follow up blog is kind of share some views on how to design permission sets, because depending on the size of what you're building, you might have one permission set. Maybe it's just a very discrete feature, and you
Mm.
have one permission set, and you assign the users that permissions to those objects and fields and what have you to do that job. But if you're building maybe multiple features or an entire application, then you might have features that are applicable to different personas or roles within your organization. You might have somebody that's an admin of that app, or a power user of that app, or a read only user of that app. So you can arrange your permission sets to represent those roles, but also group them together for power users using permission set groups. So in the past, without a permission set group, you might have had to have lots of permission sets that really overlapped over each other and duplicated permissions. Now you can
Mm.
kind of create smaller, more fine-grained permission sets and group them in different ways to represent the different personas of your application. So there's a whole science behind designing the permission sets that I kind of want to elaborate a bit more in a future blog.
Okay.
So you're right, that is an important area. If you're listening to this wondering what a permission set is, then don't dive into this until you fully understand permission sets and permission
Mm.
groups. Profiles might be something your organization uses a lot. Um, Certainly when I connected with the product managers for permission sets, I was aware that they were trying to get more adoption. And it's, some of the orgs we deal with are very old, and profiles are
Right.
very prevalent. So profiles are an option, but they're just not as that you can't really decompose your application and your features in a way that permission sets allow you to do.
Mm.
But the same what I'm saying here would apply to profiles, but obviously they're just less flexible. So I
Mm.
would try and use this as an opportunity to maybe drain some permissions from your profile and push those over into permission sets.
Yeah. When you mentioned the path A, B, C, and using profile versus permission set, I put myself into those buckets, like where my customers are in. I think I'm kind of like in this this bad situation at the moment, and
Yeah, path C.
also
Yeah,
most of the time I'm not working as the ISV vendors. I'm working with like one single org, the customer with
yeah,
customizations. And I do see a lot of them are still using profile and large profile, like sysadmin profile, whatever profiles, and then they're really in the past C at the moment because
yeah.
I see the security design are not that clear, especially when the code base is really large.
Yes, it is, and I think the design the because profiles and permission sets are all one big overlay. When you assign to a user, it does give you the opportunity to crawl, walk, run. Often we need that kind of approach when when we've got large code bases or large orgs. We need to be able to take slices off each time to make incremental progress. So my general thoughts there would be just make sure if you're migrating a certain amount of code. I mean, let's face it, you don't have to move all your code base to API 67. You could also move some of it and do this transition incrementally.
Mm.
Then when you encounter fields that are used by that code that are genuine user fields and you think they're in profiles, now that you know that list of fields and objects, consider lifting them out of of the profiles and putting them in a permission set, and then you can just immediately assign that permission set back to the same users. And as long as you put what you've extracted from the profile directly into the designated permission set and assign it, then because it's a big overlay, they don't see the difference. So, there is an opportunity to drain profiles intelligently, precisely, and move them into permission sets incrementally.
Yeah, we can
To
take
get more
small
control.
steps, and each step has a feedback loop. If you did something wrong, you missed a permission, then the user will give you the feedback telling
Yeah,
you they cannot access, right?
yeah,
Rinse
they
and
will.
repeat and going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback loop. It's a good opportunity to talk about Apex tests here as well, because Apex tests can run as different users. I think there's even a way to run all your tests as a different user than the user that you're running the operation as. Because historically we just click the run test button, or we use the CLI, and it runs the test as the user that's curating that test job. But
Mhm.
now I think you can give a different user. Now, the reason why I don't particularly like that option is because it may be that certain tests need a different type or persona of user or different permission set, and it's kind of saying that all of your tests need to run as that user, and that user might have multiple permissions sets and one profile that maybe are
Right.
too much for what
Hmm.
those tests need. So the preference that I really like, and it's been in Apex for a while, is to be able to run as a certain user. What you need to do in your Apex code, of course, is have a utility class that creates a user, and then that would assign the very specific permission sets and run as that user. And the benefit there is that you could have something in your test setup code that says, create me a user with permission sets A, B, and C. And then in another test, you could have, create me a user with permission sets C and D. And
Right.
that way you're really testing your permission sets and just those permission sets against your discrete Apex tests. And
Right.
you have much more confidence, because in reality, if you're just assigning those A, B, and C permission sets to the users, the test ran as those permission sets, then it should work.
Right. So we can on the fly create the test
Yeah.
user and also select or handpick whatever permission
Yeah.
set fits into the test
Yeah.
scenario.
You can automate all of that in Apex in your test setup, and run that. And of course, obviously this only applies, it's another passion of mine, if you're not using true unit mock testing, because then you're not hitting the database or the DML. But if you're running like unit Apex tests that typically read and write data, then you have to run as a user with the right permission sets, is the purest way to think about this.
Okay.
There's always degrees of what's possible depending on the complexity of your org to explore here, but
Hmm.
that's the ideal situation. The other thing we've not really spoken about here is sharing, and it is a little bit confusing. And I noted it in the blog here, is that we're used to having without and with sharing to control the visibility of the records the code can see or not see. And it turns out that user mode does ignore with and without sharing. It will always enforce field and object access, and it will always only return records that the user can see. Whereas when you're running in system mode, you have to use without sharing as well. So if you're elevating your Apex code, say you've adopted API 67 and everything, 80% of your code base is running in user mode, then you can be assured that the Apex runtime is checking your fields, your objects, and your record sharing for you. But if you then have the other 20% of your code or whatever that wants to run in the elevated system mode, then you have to run in system mode by tagging it in your queries and on your DML. And you also have to have without sharing in your class.
Yeah. Just make sure I got your idea correct. Is that when running the code in the user mode, it will kind of override the class with
Yes.
or without sharing, or default to the with sharing. It will use the user's record permission. But
Yeah.
if it's a system mode, then it will still check the class. Is it
Mm-hmm.
with sharing or without sharing?
Yeah.
It's indeed a bit
It is. Yeah. I mean,
mysterious,
I
right?
screenshotted the bit of the documentation. I'm looking at it now in the blog that says that. Um, so it could be a little bit of a gotcha.
Yeah. But I can understand where it comes from because again, it's this least privilege principle, right? When you run in the system mode, you keep it still in the least privilege, right? It defaults to still to check the class. Hey, if you are with
It's true.
sharing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Hey, let's keep it still the door tight. Don't
Yeah.
open it too wide. So you
Yeah. I
have
mean
to
that
explicitly mention that.
that does bring us neatly on to another thing where we're not quite done with this story from Salesforce yet, because we have a very clear story with user mode, but with system mode, the principle of least privilege does require an elevation model method. And you might think we've got it with system mode, but that's kind of super elevated. Because in
Mm.
some cases, what you really want to say is like, I'm doing all this logic for these business objects, and maybe I write to my log object. You want to elevate
For that
just to
object.
take the user permissions plus only the log object. But system mode says everything all of a sudden. So for
Yeah.
those moments you're running in system mode, you're kind of back to everything being accessible, which is what we're trying to avoid. So for that reason, there is a dev preview feature. Um, and I had a good conversation in one of the Slack channels, public Slack channels, with the PMs about it, that they're pushing to get this done, where you
Mm.
can run in user mode with an attached permission set that will elevate just enough to give you that extra level of security and access to that log object, but won't elevate to the full system mode. So that's the missing piece of the puzzle, is that you haven't got more granular elevation at the moment. You can only elevate to full system mode. What you really want is kind of my apps system mode, which is my app objects, system objects, not just all of the objects. So
Yep.
that's I think linked in some of the comments on my LinkedIn post. Actually, I don't think I linked it in the end. Did I link it
Okay.
at the bottom of the blog?
I can ask you later to get the link.
Yeah.
But to me, it scared me a little bit. I understand it's a good principle. We can have a fine-grained permissions once we elevate it up. But now we have the system mode, and then later we introduce this new feature to fine grain. Then we need to change our code shape again to downgrade. Then we can't
Yeah,
do
it
this
can
same.
be. I think, if you're going to go through, if you're particularly in Path C here, where you haven't really thought about security, the big point I make in the blog is that actually you have an exercise to do to map out what your personas are that people use of your code in your application, and also map out what objects and fields are used in what context, user or system mode. If you've got that mapping and you captured that, or you're maintaining that, then when it comes to creating a permission set for your own app system mode, then it's really just making sure that you're adding those system fields and objects to that and using
Okay.
that feature. I don't know what Salesforce will do when they add this feature. Hopefully, they won't completely remove system mode, because I'm sure I know for a fact there's a lot of utility packages, DLRS, the roll up lookup tool, needs to run in practice by its very design, needs to have access to a lot of objects. So I don't think they'll remove system mode. So when that arrives, this more granular one, you'll have time to adopt it and keep your homework from this phase to know what your system objects and fields are. And as I say, if you've got your code well structured, you should know what module to go into and what methods and things to go and apply that to. So yeah, don't lose sight of the analysis and research that you're doing, because it will help when that feature comes along. Arguably, you could create the system permission set for yourself now, but it's just not going to get used until this feature arrives. So it's just kind of added overhead until it arrives. So
Maybe you can add this thinking and a good solution in your next blog post so
yeah,
that we can steal from you.
yes, yes,
But I mean, it's a good feature and it kind of served as a wake up call for all the customers, right? You need to do the security control. But to me, when I think it through, it's a hell of a lot of work here for those Path C customers,
yes.
especially they need to keep the business running and they may want to add new features on the go. So I don't know how big of a task that it is. And well,
Well, I think as
yeah,
we were
go
talking
ahead.
about earlier, just break it down is my advice. You know, fortunately, you don't have to move all of your classes to API 67. It's never been a requirement from Salesforce to do that. I know when I was working in the ISV world, within the package, we would move everything because it just creates corner cases for backwards compatibility in the Apex runtime if you have some classes running at one version and some at the other. You know,
Right.
and I have in my past, over like 15 plus years now, encountered some quirks where I've had a mixed code base on some API versions and some others.
Okay.
But that is an option for large code bases, particularly if you've got some reasonable separation of concerns, like this set of classes is just for this module for this part of the business, and this set of classes is just for that. Then you could think about doing it that way, and incrementally adopting the
Right.
API 67. But I think ultimately the reason Salesforce has done this is that it's also tied with evolving your business around other ways in which your Apex code gets invoked, and predominantly agents. We see now that you can attach Apex code into Agentforce or even call it in other contexts. And so, as you and your business moves more into adopting those sort of things, then you should really consider this drawing down the budget for your cost of adopting AI, and therefore the benefits of adopting AI, because there's an argument to be said that this is kind of AI proofing the security of your code in a way, because not everybody's going to jump at exposing their Apex code to Agentforce, of course, but the ultimate flexibility is that the code you invest in is used in as many places as it's useful, and why lock it out from AI for the sake of not having this right security stance?
I think it's really interesting to see that since the AI wave arrives, now people pay much more attention to the Unix philosophies, like
Yes.
what the things you mentioned, the
Yep.
list of privileges. A
Yep.
simple tool should just do one thing and only one thing, and the CLI tools, all these things.
Hmm.
And also see Salesforce started to introduce the headless
Yep.
360, and the AI agent is coming to use the platforms. All these
Yep.
things actually really tight link to the security controls. We need to clean our technical debts to make sure the platform is in a good
Yeah,
shape,
I
right?
mean, I could totally imagine that this feature has been the deep flipping around the security mode in Apex runtime, has really been considered both publicly and to some degree, thinking about how it could even be done hard, right? As a hard problem, but it has
It
been
is.
solved now, and I've got to imagine that it was for the reason you've just described, that in order to promote Salesforce headless, even think about code being reused in an agentic AI experience, you've got to have this. And I think this is Salesforce putting its foot down and investing in this feature to secure itself as well as others, for that future ahead of us. Because the headless side of things is, are you really going to restrict yourself to just your objects and your CRUD operations being exposed, or do you want to expose some of your business logic that you've invested in over the last 10, 15 years? Because it'd be wasteful if not, but you might not, because you haven't got security in, and therefore you kind of you're you're kind of avoiding that value being exposed by just not having the security in place, and obviously the fear of that being a problem is real. So I think it's about unlocking the business value you've put in your Apex in a safe way. That's what this investment's going to allow you to do, and like more value of that past investment in a safe way.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I think we had a good wrap up since we started with a lot of details. Then in the end, we concluded. I don't know, before we leave, do you have anything you want to add still?
Um, I think the thing that I'd probably wrap up with is think about tools that can help you with this. There are a lot of tools these days that will help you explore your Salesforce environment. look at the
That's interesting.
dependencies, which will help you understand that. Sometimes in Apex we make dynamic dependencies on fields and objects and things that needs more
Hmm.
kind of different techniques. But largely, if you're not using dynamic Apex, then these org exploration tools will help you understand how to build those permission sets, or at least know what fields are being accessed and such like, and objects. Salesforce security scanner and PMD rules. I think since I wrote the blog, I've seen some posts saying they have started to get updated. Um, so they might
Okay.
help you.
Mm.
And then frameworks. There's a number of frameworks, including those that I've worked on and others that are actually wrapping SOCL or DML. I've seen Unit of Work or Fluent. There's the Fluent based frameworks that are out there. They all will run as user mode by default if you adopt those.
Okay.
So yes, I think my closing thoughts are look towards tools that help you do the analysis and the discovery. Work with your organization on what roles are being used. Roles and personas are often very boring things sometimes in my experience. It's like, well, everybody's using it, but okay. If you have the conversation, it's just one type of user, great. But if there's different types, you will need to think about the access controls in a different way. So use the tools to scan your org. You have the conversations with the business about the personas, and use the security scanners, and then think about libraries and frameworks that can help you,
That's
um,
excellent.
adopt default practices. I mean, and these things you could do now. You don't have to wait. That we all kind of like to put things off in life. But
Right.
here's the thing: come the moment where you need a feature in API 67, one of the other new features, or in API 68 or 69, and you haven't done this homework and this grounding, you'll really regret it. So if you don't, even if you don't plan on moving straight away, do the work to use user mode and system mode, because you can do that now. Create your permission
Mm.
sets, and yes,
Right.
if it's not fully complete, you won't get fully penalized for it right now, but you'll move yourself into the B category, or maybe the A
Right.
category. So that's
Yeah.
my message, I guess. The final message is: don't wait to move yourself into path B or path A, because when you suddenly need the features of API 67 and above, you don't want this to block you using those features.
Yeah. I think you also sent me a great message. If I haven't done the 67, then all the future new features I cannot have, right? I have to
Exactly.
pass
Yeah.
that
You can't
gateway.
just you can't go to 67 and say, "Oh, I don't want default user mode." That doesn't work.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay. Mm. But thanks a lot, Andrew. I think we covered a lot. And how about your future role? So you started your consulting role, right? You are a one-man company, or
Yes.
what's
Yeah.
your
For
plan
me,
at the
I
moment?
do partner, work closely with my clients, developers, and leadership, and so on. But yes, I'm not planning on building Andy in the Cloud Consulting to be the next SI, mega company or anything like that. I'm quite happy kind of
Mm.
doing sort of bespoke consulting in the range of what I discussed earlier at the head of the call, and it suits me just fine right now. So yeah, if anybody wants to get in touch to discuss anything we've talked about on this topic, or anything else that I discussed earlier at the top of the call, then I'm on LinkedIn. Just approach me there, and we can have a chat, see how I might be of service.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrew. I will put your LinkedIn and the blog post link. Thanks a lot, and
Thank you very
see you
much.
next time. Bye
Yeah,
bye.
thanks everyone. Bye bye.